invited Chris to speak for us today because this is really one of the most interesting hot topics for skeptics, atheists, humanists. They love this subject of science and religion, science and spirituality. And what does that mean? And who hijacked the word spirituality anyway? How come we can't use that word? What does it mean to be spiritual or religious or whatever? So I thought somebody that has a book with a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, that's got to be cool. Because that guy is totally pro-science. And yet he somehow finds spirituality in all this. So, okay, how does that happen? And so Chris is he's the University Distinguished Professor and Deputy Head of the Department at the University of Arizona. He's in charge of academic programs where he runs the nation's largest undergraduate major program in astronomy and the second largest PhD program in astronomy. His research is on observational cosmology, gravitational lensing. This is where gravities distort the space behind it, and then we can see cool stuff. The evolution and structure of galaxies. He's written more than 40 popular articles, lots of technical articles on cosmology and astrobiology, and 4 books before this beautiful book, Humble Before the Void. I like that title, by the way. That's a cool title. His previous books include Dreams of Other Worlds, The Living Cosmos, How It Begins, and How It Ends. So he knows. Wow, that's better than Revelation. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Chris Impey.
Thanks, Michael, very much. Really appreciate being here. It's a great crowd. And yes, I did it ass backwards. I wrote a book about endings, and then I thought I'd loop back and write one about beginnings, and the middle is very messy, so I'm still working on the middle. Maybe today is a little bit about the middle. So I want to talk to you about a project that took me out of maybe my normal place, my comfort zone. I teach astronomy. I'm a professor at the University of Arizona. I work on distant universe stuff. If it's closer than 1 billion light years, I don't really care. That includes a lot of interesting stuff, of course. But when you get a call out of the blue from someone who says, how'd you like to go and teach the Dalai Lama's monks cosmology, it's not something you really think about or say, well, when is that? Or well, I don't know if I can fit it into my busy schedule. You just say yes, and then you make it work. And I've been doing it now every year for 6 years. And I'm sort of going to talk mostly about the first time. When it was fresh. It's still fresh, though. And I'm going to try and give you a sense of what that means and why would Tibetan Buddhist monks be interested in cosmology or science at all. And to get there, I have to take you, of course, to India. So we're sitting in, suburban, urban, Southern California. But I want you to use your powers of imagination and transposition to take yourselves somewhere else, situate yourself on the other side of the world in the world's largest, most vibrant democracy. They just voted. The crazy thing, there were 150 million new voters in India because their country is now half under 30. So it's a fantastic country. Anyone who hasn't been should go. And this is Old Delhi, the ocean of labyrinthine, a Warren-like town, city, mostly slum, mostly incredibly poor. And contrasts of poverty and people just subsisting, and then people doing rather well, just prosperous or industrious at every street corner, just this dense web of life, this incredible youthful promise of a country where so many people are young, the colors, the sounds, and of course I'm just going to show you images and play you little sounds, and you're not going to get a sense of India because you can't smell it. Some of those smells are kind of gnarly as well. It's like, it's all mixed up. You can't get a sense of it, so I'll have to give you one little sense of it that you can't get by reminding you of what it's like. You know what the freeways are like here, and I come back here. I lived here. I was at Caltech as a postdoc, so I lived and worked right here for 3.5 years. But I don't get used to it. I have to lock into freeway driving every time I come back. But then there's India. And you always have a driver, because the driver is so cheap. And you're just driving, and there's a chasm on the left. And, it's just crazy roads. And you're just going along, and you think, No, he's not going to overtake on the blind corner. No, he's not. He's not going to do that. Oh, he's done it. Oh my God. Okay. And then there's a guy crossing the road. We're not going to hit him. Oh no, we just missed him. And that's 30 seconds, and then you can have like 6 hours of that or 8 hours of that. So getting places in India is like, it's like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, times 100. It's just hard to imagine. But the place we ended up was, by we I mean me and my son Paul, who went on this first trip, was southern India, the edge of the Himalayas. The Himalayas are disappearing into the mist here. The lower elevations are Dharamsala, where the Tibetan government in exile is about 8,000 feet. The mountains just behind rise up to 16,000 feet, but it's just this vast range that goes on forever. But at the base, you transition quickly into subtropical India with rice paddies, and it's very exotic. This is Dharamsala on the hillside, seen through the Tibetan prayer flags. Was originally an English army hill station back in the colonial days, and then it became a sort of resort town for Indians to go from Delhi. And there's a little toy train that goes up there that's kind of fun to take a ride on, a narrow gauge train, and it's cooler, of course, in the summer than Delhi. And then in 1959, when the Chinese government brutally suppressed the Tibetans and their religion, the Dalai Lama and his closest advisors and a few thousand monks fled Tibet over the ice fields, and they were very hospitably given land, a home, and a place for their government in exile in this small town. That was 1959, and they're still there, and they're probably never going to see their homeland again. It's a place of mystery, of magic, of wonder. The little things of life, the small grace notes are there all the time. You just have to open your eyes and adjust to a different place. Inside the temples, the richness of the decor, the smells, the incense, the butter sculptures, it's an otherworldly place. In the grounds of any of the major monasteries, you'll see the monks engaging in their training, which is based heavily on debate. The debates, I'll show you some more fragments of this because I co-opted this very strong part of their tradition into the pedagogy of my course. And the monks debate. They get up at dawn, the crack of dawn. They'll be doing their praying at 4 or 5 in the morning, and often you'd be wakened up to the harmonies of bird song and the low thrum of monks chanting at 5 in the morning. It's an interesting way to wake up every day. And then they would get into their debates. And then they go off and do a hard day's work. They have to make their food and feed themselves, and there's some industry and commerce associated with the monastery. They're not all just sitting meditating or praying. So they have 18-hour days, and when they were in the classroom with me, I'd have them for 8 hours, and before and after that, they'd have 4 hours each doing other things. I don't quite know how they managed it. They're not all serious. This is the head of the Tibetan Library and Archives, Geshe Lakdor. He was the Dalai Lama's main translator and aide in a decade of the Dalai Lama traveling in the West. Very interesting man. The monks also do not always take themselves seriously. And this man, Bryce Johnson, of environmental science, PhD out of Berkeley, he got a call out of the blue that led him to go to India when he was only 25 and become the Western organizer of the Science for Monks program. And it was he that called me out of the blue and invited me to go there. And he's a cool guy. And my son Paul is here today. He flew from his grad school in Finland yesterday to be here for the talk, and he's going home tomorrow. And so, that's kind of cool. And we did some traveling. And I'm sure you know, the Dalai Lama in his autobiography said that if he had not been selected or identified as the 15th reincarnation of the Bodhisattva of compassion at age 4, he would have been an engineer, because he was already famous in his family for taking apart clocks and mechanical devices and then putting them back together. He had a very analytic, precise, logical mind, and in his current job, no longer the head of state, but still, of course, the spiritual and religious leader of the Tibetan Buddhists, he thinks that way. And he realized that without a country, without a home, the Tibetan culture was in danger of becoming a museum piece. Moreover, he worried that the monastic tradition, its strength and its weakness is that it's old. Buddhism, of course, goes back 2,500 years. It interlaces with Hinduism in Asia, going back 2,500, 3,000 years. But the age and longevity of it can be a weakness too, because he knew that it wasn't renewing itself. And so some 15 years ago, he decided that his monks were not being trained to live in the 21st century, because although they have fantastic powers of concentration, discipline, their intellectual prowess is extraordinary and dedicated to philosophy and rhetoric, logic. They do study those things in addition to their spiritual tradition. They didn't know math or science. They were intellectually naive in terms of math and science. So he knew that had to change, and he started the Science for Monks program actually in 1990 to start to change that. And the program grew and initially depended on Western teachers being brought out, but as I've been in the program for 5 years, we're now the best of the monks that we've trained in these workshops that you're going to hear about are now teaching other monks, because there are 20,000 monks in exile, and I only have 35 in the group that you're going to see, so that would take a long time. So that's the idea, and it's important to His Holiness that science be part of their tradition, that they live the life of science. And you can even go back to the historical figure called the Buddha, who was famous for telling his followers as they followed around, doting on his every word, don't believe what I say, don't just take what I say for granted, cut every one of my words on steel, cut it, measure it, be a skeptic. I mean, he encouraged skepticism amongst his followers. And if I were going to say, I'm not an expert. Bryce, the guy you saw, was actually kind of amusing, because I said, why did you pick me? I haven't studied Buddhism. I don't really know that much about it. He said, I actually didn't want Buddhist wannabes in this program. And in fact, when you go to India or Tibet or places like that, the view of Eastern Buddhists towards American or Western Buddhists is often quite amused, because it seems to be a different strain of the religion. And if I were going to say one thing about it, from all the things I encountered, is that it's not really a religion. It's more accurately thought of as a philosophy or a way of life. It is the most undogmatic religion you would care to find. There's no deity, there's no supreme, knowledgeable, all-knowing figure. There's no received wisdom. There's no theological tradition of the things that have to be believed. Catholics have to believe 3 impossible things before breakfast every day. And that's interesting, because I work with Jesuit astronomers who somehow managed to square that circle. And we talk about that a lot too. For Buddhists, it's not a problem. To believe in the Big Bang, to believe in the ancient earth, to believe in rational, natural law behind all the physical things we see in the universe. Not a problem. But they are naive. Their math is about 7th or 8th grade level. So there was a challenge in teaching them the essence of what we're learning in science. And I thought as I went out there the first time, or certainly when I came back, well, there's a book in here somewhere, but writing books is hard, so it took me 5 or 6 years to get to it, or to get through it. And I think we should just start by meeting the monks. If you want it, you can have it. What you gotta do to reach up there and grab it. 'Cause everybody wants to know. And you might ask, are there any nuns? And the answer is yes. In this first cohort of this program, there were no nuns, but that was always part of the plan. And the last few times I've been out, the second, third, fourth cohorts have also included nuns. And Buddhist nuns have raised their stature within the community successively, in particular, of course, from the influence of the Dalai Lama, to, I won't say equal status, but it's a transformation from the situation a few decades ago. Well, teaching in this way, it's good as a teacher, because I've taught university for 30 years, to be in a new situation, because it induces you to basically go back to scratch, throw away your lecture notes, kill your PowerPoints, and start from scratch. So I wanted to use the experience to reorganize my material. I used an 8-fold mandala concept, but that was just a vehicle for throwing away everything I had and starting again, and getting to the essence, the fundamental parts of my subject, because they were starting from a low level of prior knowledge about physics or astronomy. So we talked about how scientists know things, and that was important. It's too often missed, even in science classes for non-science majors. There's some perfunctory talk about the scientific method in one of these cartoonish flowcharts that is not really how science works to a practicing scientist. And so we talked about how scientists know things and don't know things, and how you need to be both inquisitive and skeptical, and how theories are made and broken and so on. And we spent quite a lot of time, way more than I would in a normal course, talking about it. Because my subject was astronomy, we talked about the revolutions in the way we've seen the universe, which even for someone embedded in the subject are profound and dramatic. The fact that with the invention of the telescope, we've just been ascending a ladder of increasing light gathering power. The telescope we're building in Arizona, which will be the Giant Magellan Telescope, is 22.5-meter diameter. It's almost the size of an inscribed circle in this lecture hall. Those are the biggest telescopes we're building. It's hard to imagine. And that gain in light gathering power over the eye is a factor of 100 billion. That's the gain of astronomy, much of it in the last few decades. And then with technology in the 1940s and then onwards, we've opened up this one sliver of the visible spectrum to a factor of 1 trillion, a similar expansion in now wavelength across the electromagnetic spectrum. And as I'm sure you know, because the basis for this project is here and at MIT, the LIGO Observatory is planning to detect gravity waves from the cosmos when it comes back online just a year from now. So I expect the newspaper headlines will start to be filled in about a year with a new revolution in seeing the universe with gravity eyes that will be as profound as these other two revolutions. And most people are not aware this is coming, but in physics and astronomy, we know it's coming, we're excited. And the fact that it's an imaginative process. Too many of my students, I've just finished teaching intro astronomy at Arizona to 80 freshmen, and they either have a jaundiced view of science, or a naive view, or they just think it's all cut and dried and it's nothing that would interest them, it's too boring. But to me, I'm using the analogy of an artist taking two rusted elements of a familiar object and making something surprising and new. That's what scientists do when they understand the world in a new way, when they uncover a pattern in nature and understand it in terms of underlying connections or correlations or theories. That is profound. It's surprising. It's as creative as anything in the arts, and that, of course, is a unification between science and the arts. And the imagination, of course, is important. Newton was imagining orbits a few centuries before we had the technology to make something move 11 kilometers per second and escape the Earth's gravity. And artists and writers have been imagining other worlds for centuries and decades before we sit now with hundreds of Earth-like worlds discovered by the Kepler telescope. So science catches up with the imagination, but the imagination is there, and it does steer the science. Now, I mentioned the monks use debating as a skill, and I tried to co-opt that because it's a very formal mechanism they use. I was lucky in a recent visit to India to go to one of the southern monasteries where, in a huge gathering of the clans, if you like, the monks would debate through the night, and it looked something like this. So they are practicing, and they did this for a week, and then there'd be these huge debate-offs on this temple steps in front of people wearing, incredible regalia and an audience of thousands. But this is how they learn. It's a very formalized structure, and it's they really have to know what they're doing. I mean, it's rhetoric and logic applied in a debate. And they could be arguing about some esoteric aspect of their religion or philosophy, or they could use it for science, and we did. We talked about space, the space of the universe, and because I was so far from home, I didn't have my normal high-tech toys. I didn't have a high-tech teaching classroom. I don't think I have a picture of my classroom, but it was just a piece of linoleum or wood the size of the front of this room with some cushions on it, and that was it. There was no whiteboard. There was nothing. I mean, literally nothing. I remember asking Bryce, the organizer of the workshop, before I went. I said, well, Bryce, I understand it's rural India and it's so on, but there's some kind of basic stuff that it would be nice if I could have for teaching. And he said, okay, give me your list. And so he just let me talk for about 5 minutes, just making a list. And he said, no, we don't have any of that. So I thought, okay. So I was using things like sand. Sand was high tech. And of course, when you got the sand, you go with the sand, and you do what you can with the sand. And the sand is great because it's a metaphor, it's a simile, it's a habitable world, each one a grain of sand, a different world. And I was able to get them to do estimation by counting grains of sand. And they had the patience for this the way students in my classroom here would never. They just, the monks were doing things that if I'd asked my students here to do it and gave them extra credit and said, this is important for your grade, they'd have just looked at me like, you're freaking kidding me. You want me to count the grains of sand in a bucket? And yeah, we did that. And we leveraged it, of course, off the fact that they do sand mandalas, a wonderful display of the principle of impermanence, where it will take possibly a week for 2 or 3 monks to painstakingly, using little brass funnels that pour the grains, essentially a few at a time, to create a sand mandala, which is also almost three-dimensional, and then they'll swirl it away in a few seconds and just walk away, like, okay, we're done with that. So we were estimating with grains of sand. I gave them pictures of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, and I got them to count all the galaxies there and then project to the number of galaxies in the visible universe. Another painstaking devotional task that they did without question, without pause, without a breath. I mean, their stamina for these things was amazing. And of course, because we're far away, and this one I'll just share with you because in case you're all amenable to science, and you may find yourself at a supermarket checkout and someone behind you, just in casual conversation, turns out to be ignorant of the universe. And so while you're waiting for that line to move, you can give them this 3-step scale model. I'm handing it to you and saying, use this in public, use this with people who don't know. They may start looking at you a little weird towards the end, but it's fine. So you just have a little pea-sized object or a walnut-sized object for your Earth, and your Earth-Moon distance is this, and it cost us, let's get a little perspective here. That cost $60 billion, 2014 dollars to send 24 guys there, 12 of them walking on it, bringing back 350 kilos of rocks. That's a lot of money. And that's the Earth-Moon. And on this scale, the sun is 100 meters away, and the nearest star is not even on the Earth. It's 30,000 miles away. So that's star-to-star distances. And then you reduce that because you can't bring the galaxy into view, so you go down by another factor of 100 million, and now the entire solar system, Neptune orbit, is a grain of sand. The stars would be scattered to maybe 5 or 6 grains of sand suspended in the volume of this room, and the Milky Way is the size of the United States or India with 400 billion stars. So that's the galaxies. You still only got a galaxy in view, so you go down another 100 million, and if you're keeping track, that's 23 orders of magnitude. It's a 1 in 10 to the 23 scale model. And now, just an everyday object, the Milky Way is a plate. This volume of the local universe would have maybe 3 or 4 big plates and then a few dozen cotton wool balls to represent dwarf galaxies. The visible universe is a 3-dimensional volume the size of the United States or India with 100 billion galaxies in it. And that's only the visible universe. Because the Big Bang had expansion faster than light for much of its history, we know that space and time is larger than the volume containing those 100 billion galaxies. So that's a lower bound on what stuff there is out there. So there it is. There's your 3-step scale model. Use it as you wish. Use it wisely. With awesome power comes awesome responsibility. But just talking about it and working out the numbers and doing the math is not enough. So of course, and if this were a slightly smaller crowd and I had a little more time, I'd get you off your seats too. So we had to get up, we had to get active, and we had to act things out. That was fun. They got into that. Now remember, in this particular example, these are the geshes in the group. So there were some geshes visiting. The geshes are senior monks. I mean, think of it like a bishop in the Catholic system. And so I told my regular monks, the troops, I said, we're going to get the geshes to act out the solar system. And when I started to set this up, I was a little reticent. I thought, oh, geshes aren't going to get into it. You know, they're kind of above the fray. No, here are the geshes. Okay, now the tangents into Buddhism were quite strong. As you probably know, as a philosophical worldview and system, Buddhism holds that emptiness, vacuum, is a sort of fundamental state of the universe. And in a sense, that's true. You know, we know that the apparent solidity of everyday material is an illusion of the electrical force, because going back all the way to Rutherford, we know that matter is 99.999999999% empty space. So the Buddhists had it spot on, right back from modern physics. And so we worked out the emptiness of the universe by calculating the filling factor of the stuff in the universe, those grains of sand in that larger volume, those stars within the Milky Way, those galaxies within the larger universe. And they were extraordinarily happy. I just remember this beatific smiles on their faces when they realized that in the true physical universe, only 1 part in 10 to the 33 is anything, and most of it's nothing. That's a whole heap of nothing. So they really liked that. That was a good day. Another thing we did was we used visualization. Another thing with a little more time in a different situation I'd have us doing. I got them to close their eyes, relax, meditate, go into a meditation state, which for them, it's just like flipping a switch. And we walked our way through the universe. We visualized the universe by stepping out through the solar system, and I laid out the architecture of the Orion Arm of the Milky Way and the things they would see, and I knew they were seeing it. And we traveled out of the Milky Way, and then in other sessions, we went back to the Big Bang, we went into the atom, we did all these things in a physically realistic way, just with words. And it was amazing because they utterly bought into it. And there were poignant moments. I remember when we did a visualization of moving out from the solar system to look down on the Milky Way, as we might look on Andromeda from afar. And I reeled them back in, and then I debriefed them a bit and said, what did you see? What was going on? One of the monks, he sort of just was very quiet, and I had to get out of him through a translator what was going on. What was going on was that as I reeled him back in, and as he was suspended above the Tibetan plateau in the Himalayas, being able to see Dharamsala, where we were, and his home in Tibet, he wanted to go home. And he just stayed there for a while. And he knew he would never see his family again. So he was a bit sad. We talked about time as well as space. And interestingly, it is only the Abrahamic religions, the modern Judeo-Christian tradition, that has a true genesis, a beginning of everything. Most of the world's major religions, and especially the primordial religions and mystical systems, are cyclic time. And the Hindu tradition, which is where Buddhism is based, is strongly based on cyclic time. Now this is interesting because cosmology is sort of actually latterly caught up with this, because now that we think we understand, I'm being a little hesitant because there's some flies in the ointment with the inflation model, that big splashy press release you saw about polarization in the microwave background. The backroom story is that it wasn't nailed 100%, and there may be a problem. But let's just say there's no problem with it. Inflation happened. We know there was a precursor space-time state before the Big Bang. And cosmology is now predicated on trying to describe the precursor state to the expanding universe that we live in. And so it is now pretty routine in cosmology to consider, if not cyclic time, sort of timeless cosmologies or acausal cosmologies where our expanding space-time is just one element in a larger context. So in a sense, it totally fits with this larger tradition of time. And intriguingly, in the places where it's written down, the timescales also mesh. So we're not talking about 600,000-year-old Earth here. The day or night of Brahma in most of the texts is very close actually to the age of the Earth. And the lifetime of Brahma, which is posited in Buddhist tradition as the lifetime of interesting things happening in the universe, including intelligence, is about 1 trillion years, 1.2 trillion years. And in modern cosmology, that's the age of the stelliferous universe. In our expanding space-time, that is about how long the slowest mass stars will live before there is no light in the universe. The universe slowly goes dark, and all we are left with is black holes and compact objects. It's about the same time scale. Intriguing, just a coincidence. And we tethered this because English Tibetan was a problem. There was translation going on. It's very inefficient, actually. Their English was modest, my Tibetan non-existent, so I had translator by my side the whole time. And they were brilliant as well. They were a really important part of this. Also, in a slightly annoying way, one of the translators, Karma, was somewhat mischievous, and so you depend on this translator utterly to convey this technical language. We had sidebar meetings in the evenings to do the jargon, because there are words in science with no equivalent in Tibetan. The vocabulary had to be created. And so my translator was standing there, Karma, say, in this case, and you'd say some long thing, some long, complicated, very clever thing about cosmology, and he'd just give you like a 5-second burst, and you'd say, "What? That's it?" He'd say, "Oh, he was efficient." Okay, and then the converse was happen. You'd say some pretty prosaic statement that just took a few seconds, and he'd go on for like a minute, and they'd be laughing, and it's like, "What are you saying to them?" So you do have to trust these people. So but to avoid the issue of language, we did timelines. So we'd have events of the history of the universe from the Big Bang through the formation, evolution of the Earth, even put modern human elements in there. And they'd orchestrate. We split the monks into 7 monastery groups, and each group would align the timeline their own way. And then the groups would converge hover over it was like an expanded form of the debate discipline, where the group that was defending their timeline would sit there, and the monks from all the other groups would hover over them and, like, man, what's going on here? And I just want you to be clear that they follow seniority and they respect authority in Buddhism. So what you'll see next is a senior monk, a very senior monk actually, he's the abbot of his monastery, defending his timeline in the face of younger monks questioning the ordering of his cards. You don't need to understand this. Respect, come on. So we talked about the Big Bang, and we got them to act that out too. So here you're going to witness the first, the Planck era, so 10 to minus 43 seconds after the Big Bang, to the inflationary era, the unification, the melting together of the 4 forces, followed by the splitting off of the forces in order, the weakest force, gravity, leaving the superforce, and then splitting off the strong force that causes the atom nucleus to stick together, leaving behind the electromagnetic force joined. And each of these forces, as they split off from the superforce, operates a particular behavior in the universe. All of that happens here. And we use Lucha Libre, the Mexican wrestling mask. So of course, why not? So there's the strong force busy making nuclei out of a toy called Zoob. And the weak force is destroying them. That's radioactivity. So they're tussling. And we ended up, this got kind of Byzantine. We ended up producing a series of acts, and we ended up doing a whole play of the history of the universe, in four acts. We talk about structure of the universe, and there's a beautiful metaphor, which is also literally true in modern cosmology, where there's unification. This originated with Murray Gell-Mann in the 1960s, beautiful diagram. The Ouroboros, the snake that eats its tail, is found in almost every culture of the world. It's almost a universal symbol. But in physics, what it represents is the unification in the Big Bang between the very large and the very small. In fact, our best tests of the fundamental nature of matter will not come from the Large Hadron Collider, the Higgs particle you're going to see later on, but our most fundamental tests of physics actually come from cosmology now, because we're now diagnosing in cosmology, that discovery you read about a month ago, is diagnosing what happened 10 to the minus 35 seconds after the Big Bang. And we can never do that in the lab, never with an accelerator. It's an extraordinary situation to be in. And simple and complex have a very clever and difficult boundary line, even something as simple as the shape of a pile of sand when you dribble grains onto it. So sand can be a tool and a metaphor for nonlinear chaotic physics, as well as for estimation, as well as for miniature worlds, whatever. Once I learned all I was going to get is a bucket of sand, I went wild with that bucket of sand. And because we didn't have technology, we didn't have computers. So in this little scenario, which if I showed you more of it's like watching paint dry, so I'm only going to show you a minute, but you'll see a minute of something that basically took 4 hours or 5 hours an evening for 5 evenings. So you were going to see 35 monks spending 20 hours moving tiny little poker chips. We took an area like this and we scattered thousands of poker chips. That we had little primers for days beforehand on how the inverse square law of gravity worked. And these monks essentially did what a computer does when it takes particles in a smooth initial universe and it lets gravity operate over billions of years to form clusters and superclusters of galaxies. So our classroom was about 100 million light years across, and the monks were moving each chip in response to the gravity of each other chip. And when they'd moved one, the chips had a dot on one side and not on the other. They'd invert the dot so they know they'd moved it, and they'd pass it over it. Took a few hours. Then they'd do it again and again. Extraordinary discipline to be able to do this. They essentially, over a period of a week, did 300,000 gravity calculations by intuition, a combination of intuition in their heads, and occasionally, I said, you're going to have a lot of these to do, so you have to be methodical and purposeful. Of course, the concentration is enormous, but occasionally I said, you check with another monk. If you're not sure which way that chip could go because gravity was sort of balanced by your surrounding galaxies and just weren't sure of the vector, we'll check in with a neighboring monk. And occasionally they'd get stuck. A whole huge mini debate would spring up around one chip, and I'd just have to sort of shove them aside and say, you're taking this too seriously. We're never going to get it done. Well, things emerge in the universe. It's nothing mystical or magical, but what it means is that in between the scales of cosmology and the galaxy and humans and the subatomic scale, there are levels of complexity that we don't fully understand. There are theories that have regimes of applicability that don't apply to the next level up. And that leads to interesting things or surprising things. In simple terms, it goes against the simple reductionist idea that we're the sum of our parts or the chemicals we're made of. And there were many examples of that. Some of the ones I like are actually quite simple ones. Water is wet, clear, a solvent, and chemically polar. A water molecule is not. Now this has actually been answered. There was a paper in Nature just less than a year ago that showed that when you have 150 water molecules, it becomes water. So now we actually know how many it takes to be water. But for some other situations, it's not as clear. How many neurons, what kind of a central nervous system, and how many neurons do you need? Is a nematode brain sentient, aware? At what point in the spectrum of brains and central nervous systems does a creature become sentient or aware? Buddhists care a lot about that. I mean, in more than just an esoteric way. So we know that brains can think and be self-aware and know death and create, and no computational or biochemical analog of brains can do any of those things. And we think that they might, but that's extreme speculation. There's no indication that that will happen. So this is a very big area of science, of course, to understand this. And this leads into the idea of life. So astrobiology was the last topic of the class, and we talked about astrobiology fueled by the phenomenal progress in the study of exoplanets. And so went back to the grains of sand, of course, and now the number of Earth-like, if you wet your finger and put it in some sand, that's how many Earth-like planets we know about. Now that's really Earth-like, within a factor of 2 of the mass of Earth, and with the right amount of energy to have liquid water, so potentially habitable. It's pretty amazing because, and most of them are a few dozens to a few hundred light years away. But a few years, 20 years ago, we knew 0 exoplanets, and until 3 years ago, we knew no Earth-like habitable exoplanets. So we were unique, but that's not true anymore. And the number from Kepler, the Kepler satellite, remember, just a 1-meter telescope. I told you, we were making telescopes in Arizona the size of this room. Kepler is not in the biggest 100 telescopes in the world, if you put it in a list. The little 1-meter telescope has found many of these exoplanets. And I wanted them to understand what that implied about life in the universe, and I want you to as well. The number of grains of sand in this sandbox is how many habitable worlds there are in one galaxy, the Milky Way. These have all the ingredients for life. They have carbon-rich material, they have the potential for liquid water, and they have energy from a neighboring star. And do you imagine that they also have, there were Earths created in the universe 8 billion years before the Earth formed. So the real estate of time is just as important as the real estate of space. So do you imagine that all of those 10 billion habitable worlds are dead or inert, these petri dishes where nothing happened? Or do you think something interesting happened on at least some of them? Well, now you know why astronomers are all excited about life in the universe, even though we don't know any yet. And that's, of course, just a part of it. Logically and epistemologically, we know there are 100 billion galaxies, and our galaxy is not special. So the number of petri dishes or habitable worlds in the universe is the full, say, 5-mile arc of beach, 10-meter deep sand. Every one of those sand grains is a habitable world. So if you really think there's no one or no thing out there looking back at us as we look for life in the universe, I don't know. I think that's unlikely. So that was a powerful topic for them. Well, it's a powerful topic in science. And then we bring it back home. We have to consider our situation in this. And our situation is a little contingent. We've had to reverse the Copernican principle holds in everything we've done in science. The Copernican principle is otherwise phrased the principle of mediocrity. We're not special. Get over ourselves. Well, we don't act like we're getting over ourselves anytime soon. But if you look at the tree of life, a tree of life which in the last century would have been presented as a literal tree with simple primitive creatures below and then apes at the top and then humans at the pinnacle, is absolutely not that. This is the microbial tree of life based on parsing DNA or RNA. So this is the true genetic real estate, and humans are smaller than the dot on the top of the eye of animals. And all plants and animals are just 2 twigs on the tree of life. This is a microbial planet that we live on. And if you really want to piss off a microbiologist, and there's some nearby in Caltech, just say microbes are simple. You know, I know I did it by mistake once. I got an earful. So no, microbes are not simple. We're just sort of sacks of cells that have been orchestrated at higher levels of complexity to do interesting things. And we do have some emergent properties like brains and all that. But if you're talking about biochemical, genetic material, metabolic, any of that stuff, no. These microbes are very sophisticated. And this is a microbial planet. So what does that mean about that universe filled with habitable spots? What can we expect? What do we think is out there? We don't know. But it certainly lays an interesting idea about where we sit in this. And I didn't try and force the parallels because once Bryce had told me he didn't want to hire Buddhist wannabes into the program, I had to desperately avoid being a Buddhist wannabe. And I'm not anyway. So, but I, of course, learned from my colleagues and my students, my peers in the program. And so Buddhism, of course, speaks of the unity and connectedness of all living things, and our modern biology is acquainting us of that exquisitely. You know, the amount of genetic difference between any 2 Tibetan monks in my class, who could come from the same village even, is larger than the genetic difference between one of my monks and any of you. That's what biological genetic diversity means. So racial differences are trivial. They're biologically trivial. And then we all have the same experience. And in Buddhism, the core of that experience, which sounds perverse at the first glance, is that it's suffering. It's not that. That's the cartoon version of Buddhism. But the awareness of suffering, the alleviation of suffering, the recognition of the fact of suffering, the biggest positing of which is the fact that we're all going to die, and that's inescapable. This is important. This is at the core of Buddhism, and that it's very, and then it's commonplace. This doesn't create existential angst in the monks or any Buddhists that I met. It's just a part of their worldview and philosophy. So, it was a learning experience in both ways. And of course, science is great. Science is wonderful. I love science. But at the end of this course on cosmology, where I said we know back to the first tiny fraction of a second of the Big Bang, we've found habitable planets, we understand black holes and neutron stars, our shit doesn't stink. I was really, I was getting full of myself. And then at the end, I had to reel back and say, well, wait a minute. We don't know what time is, and we don't know what space is. We don't know what matter is. We don't know what caused the Big Bang or whether the universe is unique. And we certainly don't yet know, are we alone? So we're just sort of working our way to all those questions. And science talks about the how and the when, but it doesn't talk about the why. It doesn't give life meaning per se. It can be meaningful to have a path that includes being a scientist, but it does not give life meaning in and of itself. So we return to the same place. And then we launch the monks. They've learned enough that keeping them in that classroom is too limiting.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your protein pills and put your helmet on. Ground control to Major Tom. Commencing countdown, engines on. 2, check ignition, and may God's love be with you.
So to wind up, let me just say it was an extraordinary experience. There's a part of me that's wistful when I leave India. It's just an extraordinary place, and it's an extraordinary situation. As a cultural aside, the Tibetans live in villages, poor villages, where there are roughly equal numbers of Hindus and Buddhists, and I have never seen a hint of any, strife from that situation. They live, really simple and poor lives, and very busy and rich and dense and complex lives. And they are as receptive to ideas. This group of monks is as receptive to ideas or to science as any set of students I've ever taught. So we get busy, we do our work, we do our expanding universe and measure Hubble expansion on the surface of a balloon, and then we have fun with it. We talk about ideas in the classroom, and then they go out and debate them in formal set pieces. We talk about galaxies, and then I give my Geshe an M51 tattoo, which he proudly wears. It's impermanent, the tattoo, but then so are we anyway. We have one day off a week, and we go hiking or out gallivanting around. It's an extraordinary experience. And one thing I just pointed out, towards the end of the course is in terms of this unity. So, these are powerful ideas: interdependence, interconnectedness, unity. But what does it mean? Okay, here's what it means in cosmology. It means that there's some bizarre coincidence going on, because all of the atoms in this room, by which I mean all of your atoms as you sit there in your seat, all of those atoms were at one point, we know, based on Big Bang and inflation, in a region of space smaller than a proton, the pre-Big Bang time. They went through an incredible chronology, through an expanding, blistering hot universe. They went through the coruscating heat of supernovae and giant stars and to the cores of stars to be built into the more complex atoms in your body on which life depend. And then, of course, all of those, surprising to the young earthers, of course, every one of those carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen atoms in your bodies, of course, is more than 4.5 billion years old because it pre-existed the formation of the sun and the planets and the earth. And those atoms had multitude of paths. They went through multi-generations of stars, spread probably over hundreds and perhaps thousands of light years in the sectors of the galaxy near the sun, or where the sun would eventually be. And then they went through another amazing journey or chronology on the geological Earth, churning through magma and up into the layers where they could eventually come together. And you're only temporary guardians of your cells, of your body, your atoms anyway, but the atoms that you have been brought into this room after a 13.7 billion year journey that is quite a story. And it's a story that science has told. And it's probably one of the greatest stories we could ever imagine. And so it was my pleasure, my pride, to be able to have the pleasure of the company of these gentlemen who over a period of 3 weeks, 4 weeks, would become the Geshes of space and time. Thank you.
That was outstanding. Wow. So we'll take a few minutes of questions, maybe 10, 15 minutes of questions. And then one point of clarification, and we'll turn it over to your questions. So we always hear about the 3.7 billion year old universe, and then you had that slide about the 40 billion year old, 40 billion light year sphere.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that comes up a lot. So the conventional Big Bang, there's no smoke and mirrors, you don't even need inflation or these more esoteric ideas. The conventional Big Bang has a period of time which actually is almost 2/3 of the 13.7 billion year history, where the space between any 2 points is increasing faster than the speed of light. And although you're immediately thinking, wait, didn't Einstein say that you couldn't do that? He did, but the special theory of relativity, which posits, and in fact is observed, that light is an absolute speed limit, refers to what are called inertial frames of reference. That's the jargon, but what that really means is it refers to a laboratory situation, the solar system, a sort of proximate physical situation. And Einstein knew that the special theory was limited, which is why the general theory of relativity is called the general theory, because it deals with accelerating frames of reference, of which the universe is one. And the gravity theory has nowhere built into it a speed limit. Space-time can expand as fast as it damn well pleases. And it did. And so for most of the history of the universe, it actually, especially very early on, the distance between any 2 points was expanding much faster than the speed of light. And so what that means is, after this length of time, the furthest distance that we can see in any direction is roughly 3 times more than you think it should be. Because the universe is 13.7 billion years old, you think, well, we should only be able to see 13.7 billion light years. The superluminal expansion leads to it being 42, roughly, billion light years. So it's a model that's based on a model of cosmology, but so is the age in general.
So more than 6,000 years.
Just a tad. Yeah, I don't know how to get in the middle there. Yeah.
Sounds like you didn't have any difficulty in explaining to them this whole new concept about our world. And what's amazing about it is that they absorbed it. Was there any conflict? What was the Buddhist understanding of change? Did they accept that? Was it a totally seamless understanding of what you were telling them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's a big question because it wasn't, of course, simple. But I guess the best way of saying it is because they didn't have base coats of bad paint or a prior structure of knowledge part of the problem in the conventional Western classroom is people have misconceptions and prior knowledge that needs to be deconstructed or might be wrong. They didn't really have a lot of prior knowledge, so we were working from first principles in large part, and that helps. That really helps. That's not universally true. Some of the older monks had what is an extremely archaic and pre-Copernican mental model of the universe, Mount Meru. So that in the very simplistic form of cosmology and Buddhism, there's Mount Meru and clouds and a sort of watery layer below. That's sort of like ancient Greek, very pre-Platonic philosophy. And the Dalai Lama's just gone on record as saying that's just laughable, that's silly, So the Dalai Lama's looked and studied the 20 flavors of Buddhist cosmology, and he's pretty much, he doesn't like to tell people what to believe or what's right, but he's pretty much said, well, these ones are just silly and stupid and wrong, and and these ones are potentially interesting. So the monks already have guidance to steer them away from silly ideas. But yeah, they were approaching it from first principles, and so they were receptive to most things. And the scales of space and time were not an issue at all, because that's part of their worldview, actually, to have potentially infinite scales of space or time, and to be microscopic or infinitesimal within those scales of space or time. Not a problem for them.
Yeah, when you showed the video of them practicing their debating skills, what was the purpose of this gesture where they would like smack past the side of it?
Oh yeah, I don't know all of it well enough to explain it, but there are a whole series of formalized gestures, and they're actually tied, if you like, with some of the dogma of Buddhism. When they apparently do the percussive slap, they're closing the door to rebirth. So they're making a point. It's like a double meaning. They're making a point of great, strong emphasis, and they're just saying you can't get out of this. So that's a very forceful, and in some parts of those set pieces, they'd be jostling each other, and I would look at it and think, whoa, this is a little intense. But there was a woman from my university teaching biology alongside me in the workshop, and she came back early in the workshop to dinner, and she was just musing with a smile on her face. She said, I've never been in a room of 35 men with so little testosterone on display, So while they would be intense and intently into what they're doing, there was no animus. There was no edge to it at all. And I think you could see that when the Geshe was getting a hard time, almost mockingly from the younger monks. Yeah, it was actually mocking. You could see that. You don't need the translation to know they were mocking him, but it was gently done. It was affectionately done, and that's very unusual, that tone, and in these formal debates where often it's quite a strong, there's a lot of strong and even harsh. The younger monks, if they were in the sitting position on the receiving end, they would show a body language of humiliation, of abject shame and humiliation, and you'd start to feel bad, and then you'd see them just hop up and reverse roles, and they would be reversed. So, they don't take it too seriously. All right. Let me go up to the back. Yeah.
Was there any discussion on different dimensions, or they might have saw the soul, or?
Yeah, good question. They were not savvy, or they didn't have any prior knowledge or expectation about multi-dimensions in the way a physicist might talk about multi-dimensional space-times. And also, they don't actually spend, I have to have this translated because I can't converse so easily with all but a few of them in English. They don't talk about soul a lot. It's not a word or even spirit. That's just not probably the biggest area, in case it comes up as a question, the biggest area where I, don't walk through the door or drink the Kool-Aid is reincarnation. But even then, I went there with probably a cartoonish view of what a Buddhist thinks reincarnation is, or karma, those words that are well known in the West. And by the time I'd sampled a range of people expressing what they thought that meant, I saw that it was, well, first of all, sometimes it was so metaphorical and abstract, it was just so far from being literal that it was a philosophical idea. No, that's not always true. Some say, I met a monk, we met a senior monk who claimed, who had been told he was a reincarnated senior monk in Tibet that was killed violently by Chinese troops in a particular year, and he claimed to have the stigmata of the way his previous incarnation died. And I was like, whoa, so, you spend some time there, you're going to hear some things you don't know what to make of that I, as a scientist, can, does not compute, so. But mostly, those words, spirit or soul, they didn't come up very much at all. Yeah, let me go on this side.
It seems like they're pretty enthusiastic about science. Are they able, are those young ones able to go to school to have formal science training if they wanted to? Did you get any sense of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's tough because the monasteries are isolated. They're huge. Most of the monks are in a series of huge monasteries in the south that have 3,000 or 4,000 monks, and their equipment is incredibly primitive. So they cannot typically leave their monasteries to go and get educated elsewhere.
So they couldn't go into, say, India somewhere if they wanted to?
Some have. All the translators in the program had been to college in India, different colleges. But the monks are pretty much in the monasteries. That's how they can't make a living otherwise. But what's happening is the science is going into the monasteries. Basically, in this sort of second phase of this program, in its second decade, the major monasteries are getting a set of the best trained monks through this program who have like refresher courses now twice a year. They're getting science labs and science equipment areas. We have partners now in the program with the Exploratorium and the Smithsonian, and those two well-funded American institutions are basically sending kits, hands-on science kits, to these science rooms and workshops in the monastery. So we're bringing the hands-on science into the monasteries, and the monks are being trained along the way. But it has to happen there.
Do you foresee any scholarships maybe being offered to India to get these maybe young kids if they wanted to?
Funding the program is a challenge. At the moment, the Bobby Sager Foundation, he's a philanthropist out of Boston, he funds the program. It's not well funded. Dalai Lama, has funds that all go straight into the Tibetan government in exile because the number of Tibetan orphans leaving China just continues to grow. They have to build a new Tibetan school, which is basically an orphanage, every year to cope with the influx of young people leaving China. So it's very tight on funding the science. I would say it's not funded to do what you're saying, but it's a good idea. Yeah.
You said so much of your experience with them was explaining the scientific process, a lot of what and a lot of when, and not a lot of why. It seemed like there's a vacuum there. And was there any dialogue with them about their perspective of the why that may have been missing in your course?
Do you mean the why we do it or why it happened?
Why it happened.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I'm trained as a physicist, so when I talk about the why, it's typically it's really a why in terms of how, starting from simple conditions. If the universe was initially hot, small, dense, and nearly uniform, how do you end up with this? A room full of people listening to a lecture. That's pretty wild. So in a sense, that's a why for me. And so we talk about it in pieces. It's hard. I don't know if we talked about the big why with a capital W, because that's philosophy and that's maybe something else. And they're curious. They're definitely curious about that. I mean, they have a tradition which is not based on sort of natural causes and initial conditions and some sense of that. So this is new ways of thinking for them. Yeah.
You quoted the Dalai Lama early on saying that if there were contradictions between science and Buddhist beliefs should be thrown out. In the slides that you put up about your experience, you mentioned a few times that there was some, at least metaphorical, agreement between the cosmology that you were teaching and their beliefs. Were there any cases where there was a contradiction, and how did they react to that?
So I sort of alluded to one. A subset of them, about a quarter of the monks, held to this pre-Copernican worldview of cosmology. They had a mental model of the universe based on Mount Meru and layers and a subterranean, not hell, but a subterranean watery place that's chaotic. And they really believed that. So yes, for that quarter, and they weren't all senior, some were, but there were a few young ones who had that. So yes, for them, And it was, of course, facilitated by the fact that the bulk of the class, even if they didn't know, bought into the Copernican and beyond view very quickly. And so they would just, kind of slap these guys around and say, come on, get with the program. Oh, look at this. Or they'd ask questions. It was all done by rhetoric. So they would ask skeptical questions about that model. Well, if this is up and down and gravity works this way, what does that mean? And so we use those tools to deconstruct some of those primitive ideas. I'll give you another example, though, in biology. I wasn't teaching biology, but I encountered a very interesting, we did a version of this timeline where I got different creatures, microbes up to humans, and I asked them to put them on a spectrum of intelligence, however they thought that word meant, and I asked them to say, where's the line of sentience, self-awareness? It was interesting to do. I mean, I'm not sure biologists would know where to draw that line. And some of them put that line down near plants. Not all, but some. So on biology issues, there was a real range going on there. And they didn't have any understanding of modern genetics and biology, not part of their training. Unfortunately, it only came into my course near the end with astrobiology, and I couldn't do a whole biology course if someone else was doing that, but not till the next year. So, but yes, I would say in biology was the biggest disconnect with what modern science.
But were they willing to throw out?
Oh yeah, yeah. Because remember one of the other precepts, non-attachment. Like the Dalai Lama wrote a foreword for my book, which is really cool, but I'm not attached to that.
How did they start out being a monk? Did they go into it like volunteer when they're?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's for people from and this is true elsewhere in the world and in other situations, for people from dirt poor countries, and Tibet and northern India are dirt poor, it's a living. It's a reliable, safe, it's a good living, a respectable living. And so what tended to happen in Tibetan households, which had fairly large families because it's subsistence farming, one or more children, sort of like Catholic families in Ireland where one's given to the church, one child would become a monk or would be steered towards being a monk. And that often had happened before they left Tibet. The typical monks in the program and the typical Tibetan children who arrive without parents brought over by, the Tibetan equivalent of not mules because they're not doing it badly for money like Mexican immigrants, but they're being brought over by people who will return. They're typically 7 to 9 or 10 years old. And their monastery then is their sanctuary. I mean, they are brought up in an orphanage, which is part of a monastery, and then they become monks. And it does sometimes feel a little sad when you go into a village and you see like a 7-year-old boy walking around in robes, and he's a monk and he's an orphan, and you think, God, it doesn't feel very good. But then, you can't hang on to that when they're just laughing and playing and they have buddies and their life seems okay, But it's not easy because they will never communicate. The Chinese started jamming the cell phones about 3 years ago, so even though they now have cell phones, they often can't talk back to their parents or their families. So they're pretty isolated.
You mentioned the name of one translator that you
Yeah.
had been closest. What was that name? I've heard some tapes. Or do you remember?
Oh, the head of the Tibetan Library and Works is called Geshe Lakdor, and he was the Dalai Lama's translator, and he was the guy, the go-to guy when they arrive in New York to make sure they have the hotel reservations and nobody screwed up and so on. And he's an amazing person, and he's in charge of preserving the Tibetan culture because the library has what they could bring, the scrolls they could bring from Tibet, much of which is left behind is now destroyed systematically. So their culture pretty much now resides in 1 or 2 monasteries.
Chris, let's do one more.
Okay, yeah.
I missed the beginning of your talk. Are these monasteries all in Tibet or some in India?
So the places I lectured and Paul and I were at one of these there are typically Indian hill towns that have monasteries, small monasteries. There are essentially 22,000 Tibetan Buddhist monks in exile. They're The Tibetan population is 6 million. The diaspora is about 1 million that's living overseas. 20,000 of those are in India, and they're mostly in large monasteries in the south. So, and they're mostly in India. The Indians opened their arms to the Tibetans. Mostly in the south, because the land was cheap. They were given, the government in exile was given land in the Tibetan hill town of Dharamsala, which is where you were looking at for the most part. But the bulk of the monks are in huge monasteries in the south of India, in kind of Karnataka, hard scrabble, poor, terrible land. I mean, they have to grow their own food. And the government, good for the Indian government, welcomed them, gave them land, gave them government in exile, at some cost to them, because India's relations with China have not always been harmonious, and they worry about China, and it's a huge irritant to China that they continue to give sanctuary to so many Tibetans.
And the monasteries are all closed in China, right?
They're either closed or under siege, I guess is the best way to put it.
Let's thank Chris one more time.